Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee. Sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
It's happening, y'all. The moment so many of us were waiting for, a majestic place right here in New Mexico that the public hasn't been able to see or visit now for more than 4.5 years, is finally reopened.
Yeah, so just a couple days after the November election, the Bureau of Land Management and Cochiti, Pueblo put out a bombshell announcement, as I'll call it, the reopening of the Kasha-Katuwe Tent Rocks National Monument. Even if you haven't been, you've probably heard of the Tent Rocks. It is one of the state's most popular tourism hiking spots. That was before the closure, with the landscape etched out of volcanic ash millions of years ago, sitting on the ancestral lands of what we know now today as the Cochiti Pueblo. But as mentioned, it has been closed off since the COVID shutdowns in March 2020.
Yeah, we covered this prolonged closure on our podcast last summer with an expert that we brought back for this big update. So let's welcome back our guest, now retired UNM Professor, Dr. Gary Smith. Thanks so much for joining us again.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Gabriella and Chris.
Yeah, you're welcome. We appreciate you being here and hope retirement's been treating you well so far.
It has, very much so.
Excellent.
So last time we talked about the Tent Rocks National Monument was in June of 2023 with you on this show. And I remember you saying that you had friends who were asking you for updates. When is it going to reopen? So how did you hear that it was finally reopening? Do you remember where you were?
Well, it's a good question. I know that I heard it on, I think, your newscast. I know that I didn't have any advance notice or any inside scoop. And it was a surprise. I mean, we hadn't heard anything for a couple of years about what might happen, just that negotiations were underway with the BLM and Cochiti, and I just didn't anticipate that there was going to be a quick resolution.
Yeah, I think we all felt the same way in the newsroom. That email just popped up and was like, oh, okay. That's where we're at now, finally here. And it just happening a couple days after the election, I think, as well. You know, it starts to spark questions like, well, why now? Why now? But yeah, point being, it has finally happened. So obviously, Dr. Smith, you've been familiar with this place long before most of us even knew about its significance, before it was a national monument. You took students there back in the 80s, right?
Right. I made my first visit there, I recall, in April of 1988. I had just come to UNM the previous fall, and it was clear that this was an area that would fit very well into my research interests in geology at the time, and volcanic geology in particular. And in addition, at that time, the University of New Mexico actually owned the land north of the current monument. So when you pulled all that together, it was clearly an area for great research and teaching opportunities. And I had several students who worked on master's theses and undergraduate senior theses in the area. We took several editions of the International Volcanology Summer Field Course into that area to do field studies, and then lots of field trips with student groups, teachers, even one high school group.
Yeah, wow. And just to quickly kind of recap the historical significance and part of why it became so popular. So this was near the end of the Clinton administration. The BLM, as I understand, they asked you to use your expertise essentially to help secure this national monument status for that site. Presidential proclamation was signed by the then outgoing president, Bill Clinton, in January 2001, and that declared the Tent Rocks a national monument. But, you know, this act of protection that they did, it also really did put it on the map, right?
Yeah, and actually I think in many ways the initiative to make the monument status was a result of it already being on the map, and the need to protect it. And it was interesting to watch because when we first started working there in 88, 89, even up into 1990, most days you wouldn't see another soul. You might see somebody there on the weekend, weekdays, not at all. There were no marked trails. The road was nowhere near the condition of the road now. It was a rough one, and it was subject to washouts. Four-wheel drive was recommended. and it just wasn't really well known. And then I got the impression that what really changed things was it was there somewhere around 89, 90 maybe. Someone wrote about it in a day hiking guide for hikes from Santa Fe. And man, we started just seeing all these people. What I didn't know was that the BLM had already designated it an area of critical environmental concern around 1986 or 87. But they didn't really, at least visible to me, start showing evidence of protection there until around 1990 or 91 is when they actually made a parking lot. They started closing off some of the secondary roads and off-road trail access areas and actually put up a sign saying it was an area of critical environmental concern. But yeah, the word was out and people were coming in droves to see this beautiful place. And when the BLM contacted me to help with the drafting of President Clinton's proclamation, it was clearly because they and Cochiti, Pueblo, and even authorities of Santa Fe County were concerned about having the opportunity for resource protection for a place that was getting such high visitation, which was still very small compared to what was happening in the 2000s.
Yeah. We saw exponential growth there. I did an investigation about it last year. We can link to that because it showed some of those annual numbers and just how much the foot traffic increased, which at one point I think they were getting 130,000 visitors a year. But I want to go over some of the updates that we know that we're talking about today that the BLM and Cochiti Pueblo have announced with this reopening. So prior to the closure in 2020, it used to be that you could pay $5 per vehicle to visit the Tent Rocks. Anyone could go. I remember doing news stories over spring break and seeing lines and lines of cars just waiting to get in. Now it's going to be much different. You have to reserve tickets online first at recreation.gov. It is $5 per person instead of per vehicle for those over the age of 16. And then you go to a separate website to buy a separate $20 per person tribal access pass. So those tribal access passes are for kids ages 2 to 16 are $10, $20 for adults. So a lot bigger fee increases right out of the gate here with this new online reservation system. We know part of the concern pre-closure was the preservation of the monument, and they were getting a lot of foot traffic, as we mentioned, every year, more than 100,000 visitors pre-pandemic. So, Dr. Smith, what were your thoughts when you saw this new reservation system? Did it make sense to you, or did it seem excessive at all?
I assumed there was going to be a reservation system. That was the only way you were going to get the numbers back down to the 50,000 that the environmental impact statement had been designated for the site. And, you know, many national parks and monuments in the post-pandemic travel flux across the country have put in reserved entry. That part didn't surprise me. The size of the fees surprised me. In fact, I did a quick check. I can't find any other national park or monument in the country that would cost people that much to go to. A lot of places have fees of $20 or $30, but that's per vehicle. It's so you could bring your family for a relatively modest amount of money, and usually those permits are good for more than one day. So I think that, you know, while giving away the reservations themselves could have limited the access to the numbers that were desirable, it almost seems to me that the imposition of the fees is really meant to help make it less likely for people to want to go. That said, I did notice when I went in just a couple of days after the reservation system was supposed to be available for reserving up through the middle of next month, and everything was sold out. So that's not certainly keeping people away from the popularity. It's also interesting that there's a requirement that even once you have your ticket, both from the BLM and Cochiti, that you follow a pilot car into the site.
Yeah, we'll get into that.
Yeah. Which is another interesting step in the process.
Yeah, to me, it certainly seemed like just seeing those fees, I think to your point, it really feels like it is this push towards, if you really want to go to Tent Rocks, you got to show us as well, and you got to pay for it, to really kind of gatekeep out that high number of people, that high volume of people. Because again, I think as Gabby was saying, is well over 100,000 visitors that the monument was seeing pretty much from about 2015 or 16 onward until the closure. And to what you were saying, Dr. Smith, that this, they want this to be somewhere around 50,000. So you're talking about cutting the volume in half, or maybe a third, even in some of the more really busy years. Let's talk a little bit about that drive-out system. So along with the fees, you can't just drive out to the monument on your own. All the visitors who go to Tent Rocks with those 2 passes that they have to buy now, they have to check in at the Cochiti Visitor Center and then wait for this pilot vehicle to direct them out to the monument, which again, never existed in the prior iteration of the management of this monument. What is behind this, do you think, and what will this help address?
I don't know for sure, but I have a guess. A visitor to Tent Rocks, even though it's on federal BLM land, drives through about 3 or 4 miles of Cochiti, Pueblo in order to get there. And I do know that one of the concerns that Cochiti had expressed as the volume of use went up was that there was a lot of traffic through the Pueblo, which is a private place to them, included drive past a number of homes. And people didn't always obey the speed limits. They didn't always obey the no trespassing signs. And there were, interesting things to see along the way, and people would get off and cross fences or go elsewhere to take pictures and so forth, and that was trespassing on Cochiti land. So I'd be willing to guess that the reason behind the pilot car is to make sure that people respectfully cross Cochiti land to get to the Tent Rocks site.
Got it. Yeah. And I did ask, I asked the BLM a couple of those questions, and they directed me to Cochiti, which, that would make sense. So,
and I should note as well, we had a reporter go out there on opening day who reached out to Cochiti, Pueblo as well. Still waiting to hear back about that. As of when we're recording this is the day after the opening.
Yeah. So if you haven't been to Tent Rocks, it's actually, like you mentioned, on BLM land. It's on the outskirts of the Cochiti Pueblo, about 45 minutes north of Albuquerque. So a pretty easy drive to get to this place. But you do have to go through the Pueblo gates to get to the National Monument. So the BLM retains management of the monument, whereas Cochiti handles the day-to-day operations. What is your understanding of that shared responsibility, and what's been the thought behind it?
Again, I can only guess. I do know that back when the monument was originally established in 2001, it was definitely seen as a partnership between the BLM, Cochiti, and significant participation by Sandoval County, who upgraded, paved, and maintained the road. And so from the outset, it was understood that there was going to be joint management between Cochiti and the BLM. The impression I get from the information on the website, which is the only information I have, is that has been formalized now in a way that has much more responsibility to the Pueblo for all the day-to-day operations. Those terms haven't really been used before. So I see that as an outgrowth of the negotiations that the BLM said they started really in earnest in 2022 to come to a new agreement on the joint management. And in many respects, I think it's an appropriate thing given the interests of the Pueblo as well as the public as a whole, and it's certainly given the Pueblo the impetus to create various policies and rules and fees and so forth that they see are appropriate.
Yeah, and we should note that from this report that came out in early 2024, this being the Tent Rocks National Monument Managers Report. They do really note that partnership. They call it one of the most unique partnerships in BLM is with the Pueblo de Cochiti. So certainly a unique partnership when it comes to the entire nation is what it sounds like in all these national monuments out there. So right when this reopening announcement was made, we talked a little bit about this, but it quickly sold out through mid-December. And if you look now on the website, that is it for now. You can't actually go beyond the existing dates and find a new one to book out there. So they'll have a seasonal closure that lasts through January 31st to 2025, where the website then as well says, check back for updates. It sounds like you have not been able to reserve a spot out there, but you want to.
I definitely want to. I'm anxious to go back. My last visit out there was in the fall of 2019. So I'm definitely anxious to go back myself. There has been one inquiry, folks wanting to know whether I could take them out to show them the geology. Which also raises an interesting point in my mind, because so much of what I did out there from, say, 2000 onward was to take groups. And there isn't anything explicitly said on the website about the arrangements for educational groups to visit and what fees are necessary for that. I mean, it would become prohibitive to take a couple of van loads of college students out on a field trip if we're going to be paying $30 a head to get them there. And it might be that a direct outreach to the BLM would indicate that there is some other process for that. But I was disappointed that there wasn't something on the website that directed groups, particularly educational groups, not for-profit tourist groups or something, to visit the site.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Monica Wicki, host of New Mexico Living. This episode of New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you enjoy New Mexico News Insiders, check out New Mexico in Focus, a great source for insights about what's happening in our state. Catch their podcast and videos at nmpbs.org or stream it anytime, anywhere on the free PBS app. Now, let's continue to New Mexico News Insiders.
I had a phone call with the BLM PIO asking just a couple of follow-up questions that weren't clearly outlined in the release. One of them was the fees. So the $5 fee goes towards the BLM, right? And then the $20 fee, the more expensive one, is to the Pueblo de Cochiti. So I was asking, well, what does that fee go towards? And yeah, tell me a little bit about the thinking behind that. But those are questions I didn't get answered before this recording. I also asked the BLM whether it's looking to cap the number of daily or annual visitors. Like, do they have a number in mind that they don't want to exceed, since that has been a concern over the years? The spokesperson couldn't give me a solid number or tell me how many passes they'll allow to be sold per day. So that's kind of unclear also. Only she said they'd send out a news release with more information when they open back up the reservation system. So I'm assuming we can just keep refreshing the page as we have done the last 4.5 years. We'll kind of see.
Yeah, I'm surprised. There has to be a target, because obviously there has to be a way for the reservation system to know it's sold out. So they have to have a target of the number that can be reserved. Now, whether they're also kind of holding to the side those that might come as special requests and how to make those special requests is quite unclear.
Do you imagine this new system with more barriers will maybe just deter annual visitorship? It sounds like yes, from kind of what we've discussed here in this conversation. Do you think, that gatekeeping of having a certain number of passes and a pilot car really does seem like it is the bulletproof way of keeping people out? But what are your thoughts? Do you think that this is kind of going to work?
Well, I think it, obviously if you're only providing access to a certain number of people, it will work to keep that access to that number of people, and it won't go beyond that. It may be pent up interest in getting back that led to the initial sellout of the first month or so of access permits, and that will dwindle off with time. But my hunch is that they still won't have, they'll still find it pretty easy to see 50,000 people there. What it'll cut back on, which I think is true at other national parks and monuments, the reservation system, are the people that don't plan ahead. Which you have to do now, particularly in the summers at just about any national park. I mean, if you want to actually get in, you have to buy a timed entry permit. So I think people that really want to go to Tent Rocks, if they're not locals, are going to have to build that into their plan, and they may not be prepared to do so. So it wouldn't surprise me that the people that will be sort of lost from the system will be the non-locals. That the people from Albuquerque and Santa Fe and Rio Rancho areas who enjoy going there a lot will just make their plans ahead and will book the times they want to be there.
Well, and like you mentioned, it could be that, yes, they can prohibit the amount of passes they decide to sell each year, but what is the demographic of the people buying those tickets? They're the ones that can afford it, right? Afford to take their family of 5. So that could certainly be prohibitive to the audience that we see at Tent Rocks.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I've been concerned about access in all of our national parks and monuments with fee systems and for families, but this is even more regressive in that sense because it is a per person charge, not a per vehicle charge. And so, yeah, if you think about it, mom and dad and a couple of kids who are over age 2, you're looking at it's $100 day plus your gas to go to Tent Rocks. And whereas I've always kind of felt like, as long as national park and monument access for families wasn't any worse than going to a movie, that maybe was the way you spent your day. It was like taking the family to a movie. But this is obviously much more.
We should note that one of the things that you can determine based on the purchase of this pass, there's some language on here on the Cochiti Pueblo Tribal Access Pass, which they say that it grants access just to the monument, not to the reservation itself, but they say that will essentially help support the preservation of ancestral lands and livelihood for generations to come. So that's kind of the window in that we have towards like where does that pass money go towards is just a little blurb on where you buy that, which is this website right now called Purple Pass. So
I do know that when in the original system with about a $5 per vehicle charge or whatever it was, that when that was originally set up around 2000, 2001, that was part of the joint management arrangement between the BLM and Cochiti at that time. And it paid for Cochiti folks to actually staff the entry station, to patrol the trails, to haul trash out, to take care of the restroom facilities and so forth. So, and the wear and tear and gas on vehicles to do that. So when you are the day use administrator for a place and you have staff, obviously there's a use of fees to help pay for those folks. And it provides a little bit of local employment for folks at Cochiti.
Do you know who you're going to take with you on your first visit when you can get back out there?
Well, I have to admit that it may be kind of a selfish visit because although I've gone there so many times as a geologist, in retirement I'm particularly engaged a lot more in photography. And I owe a photography friend a day at Tent Rocks, where we'll probably both go out and do a lot of photography, and I'll describe the geology to him. But it wouldn't surprise me that if there are educational group opportunities, that folks in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department at UNM or elsewhere may ask me to take students out.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about the logistics of this new setup of how people can access and see this really just wonderful geologic site. But can you tell us from your perspective, what makes this place so special that you can't quite get from just looking at pictures of it? What should people understand about Tent Rocks?
Well, what anybody immediately appreciates when you get there is it's a relatively small postage stamp area with these remarkable conical shaped rock hoodoos and tents. Just a really impressive narrow slot canyon that Probably should have a waste dimension limit posted on it somewhere. And it's unlike anything you see in the landscape around it. So there's something very unusual about the geologic conditions, the landscape conditions, to allow that to be there. And so that's part of what geologically is interesting, is why, because those same rock layers are present over a large area, but why do they have this expression in the landscape in this relatively small area? And it's a combination of some very unique geologic circumstances on that one spot. But then there's the nature of what does the geologic history tell you that's recorded in those rock layers. And the geologic processes, the volcanic eruption processes about 6 to 7 million years ago that laid down many of those layers, are processes that are very difficult to study around active volcanoes because it's very deadly. But when you can see them laid out in 3 dimensions in the ways they are at tent rocks, they provide a really incredible laboratory for studying those volcanic processes. And then you add to that one of the major faults in the Rio Grande Valley, one that's potentially capable of producing earthquakes in the future, runs right through the monument. So the opportunity to look in great detail at the structures of a fault system, of a major fault like that, is not something you can do readily in many places. So you got all this in the same single little piece of real estate, which to many people is just this incredible scenery to walk through and hike through. But the geologic processes recorded there are what really help contribute to its uniqueness to have it set aside as a national monument.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Logan Rader, host of New Mexico Living. New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
If you like New Mexico News Insiders, learn more about New Mexico in Focus, a weekly hour-long show analyzing decisions impacting New Mexico statewide. Stream it anytime, anywhere. Visit nmpbs.org and follow them on all social media platforms.
Now back to New Mexico News Insiders.
Well, I'm excited to get back just from, your description of it. I have memories as well going up there, and it's a relatively easy hike. Is there anything else that we are missing, though, that you want to add?
I don't really think so. I think this has been an interesting history, and I don't know how it compares to the history of other national monuments, but it's interesting that it went from a place with almost zero visitation to a place that has been visited by so many people and so well known, that it does involve this rather unusual collaboration between an indigenous group and those federal offices managing it. The only other place nearby that really comes to mind would be Canyon de Chelly, which is jointly operated by the Park Service and the Navajo Nation. And so it has those unique aspects to it as well, which actually were critical in the creation of the national monument, because as often happens, a Democratic president will be leaving and use presidential authority under the Antiquities Act to designate enlargements of monuments or add monuments. And then if a Republican administration is coming in, they try to eliminate those. And that happened in 2001. George W. Bush's administration immediately scrutinized all these last-minute declarations by President Clinton and tried to undo many of them. And it was thanks in large part, as I understand, our Republican Senator Pete Domenici at the time telling President Bush, no, this is a good one. This is one we should keep. And it really is something that represents a collaboration between all stakeholders to make something special happen. So leave this one be.
Yeah, that is fascinating. A history of bipartisanship in there as well. That obviously, I think that a lot of people would think there's not quite as much of that going on these days. So anyway, we really appreciate your time, Dr. Smith. Thank you for joining us for this conversation.
It was fun to have a follow-up chat about things, and it'll be interesting to see where it all goes from now. And, if you'd like to have a tour leader on your own visit to Tent Rocks, just let me know.
All right.
There you go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, a big thanks to Dr. Gary Smith for joining us here for this secondary Tent Rocks conversation. If you haven't caught our first one, that's a good one to go back to. We can always link to that as well in the show notes. Looking forward to getting back out there, especially now since I've had a kid since this actually was last open. So would love to show him such a delightful place that
Yeah,
Tent Rocks
I was
is.
thinking about that too. It is a pretty good, easy-ish hike to take with young children. So I can't wait to take my daughter as well. There's definitely a lot to see, and it's just so uniquely different than the landscape in other parts of New Mexico. So we recommend, this is not sponsored by the Tent Rocks, but we are endorsing a visit to the Tent Rocks.
Yeah,
if you
gets
can.
the official thumbs up.
Yeah.
I guess you could say officially official for whatever officiality we have on our own opinions.
We're very
So-
official. Yeah. If you guys have any story ideas or people you'd like to hear from on our show, feel free to reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email and gburknm on social media.
And don't forget, if you're watching this on Fox New Mexico, you can watch the full conversation on krqe.com/podcast. It's also our YouTube page at krqe. You can also reach me at Chris McKee TV and also chris.mckee@krqe.com. Thanks for listening.